Morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this online event organized by the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication at the George Washington University. We are delighted to have you with us today to discuss the new fascinating book just published by Tinatin Japaridze, Stalins Millennials, Nostalgia, Trauma, and Nationalism. And before giving the floor, I would like to introduce my colleague here who will be moderating and sharing the discussion. Diana Egletis is Associate Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at GW, and she will be introducing Tinatin and then moderating the discussion. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlene. Tinatin, it's a pleasure to welcome you here. Tinatin is a new author. She is the author of the new book, Stalins Millennials, Nostalgia, Trauma, and Nationalism, which just came out, I believe, last week. Many of you probably have not had the opportunity to read this fascinating and wonderful book. I will be asking Tinatin a few questions that'll give her the opportunity to share some of the key ideas, and we'll leave the latter half of our meeting this morning for those who'd like to ask questions. Ladies and gentlemen, feel free to put questions into the chat box. I can read from there, or if you'd like to ask your own question at the end, you'll be able to do so by raising your hand. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado then, I would like to start with kind of a basic question. Tinatin, your book is called Stalins Millennials, but your book in fact features three Stalins. And I wonder if you could talk about the three Stalins that feature in the book and how each of them is significant.
Thank you very much, Diana. First of all, I have to thank you all and the entire George Washington University community writ large for having me here. It is a fabulous opportunity. And since I am living in DC myself, it means all the more. I can probably see you from my window in some way. So I very much appreciate the fact that we are able to have this conversation and have this conversation in an intellectually invigorating, but at the same time, very safe environment, because I know that these are very uneasy times. And some of these topics a few weeks ago, even if not less, would have been very different for us, because we would be having a discussion as historians, as international affairs specialists, and we would be talking about the past. Unfortunately, we are now talking about the present. And sadly, my fear is that we are also talking about the future. And I would love to be proven wrong. So I hope that this is very much a conversation and we are able to have a dialogue between the two of us, but also with the community that is attending this event. And I would very much welcome and appreciate your thoughts as well, dear attendees, because this is something that we are living through today. And I think the fact that we are able to have this conversation is going to allow us to together process and digest, for lack of a better term, a lot of the very tragic, very frightening, and also not in the best way, fascinating times that we are witnessing today. In terms of your question, Diana, so I wrote initially, my idea was to write about the legacies of Joseph Stalin in my native Georgia, as well as in Russia, that for many years in the 1990s, a very different Russia nonetheless, was my home. So that was my adopted home as a child when my parents relocated from Tbilisi to Moscow. So I was in many aspects trying to understand if we are still to some extent wrestling with the legacies of the Stalinist era and sort of using Stalin as a mythological figure rather than the figure of Stalin as the politician, so to speak, as a historical figure. And the two Stalins, it's of course no secret because I'm a huge admirer of his work. Simon Sebag Montefiore has written extensively about Stalin, among other fantastic authors and historians. He is perhaps, to me personally, his work resonated with me the most. So I was in many aspects relying on those pillars of Stalin the way that Montefiore talked about him. And although having had the pleasure and the honor of conversing on various opportunities with Simon, he did tell me that there are, in fact, multiple Stalins. In fact, we had a different discussion about there being really 5 Stalins as far as he's concerned. But at least some of the work that I had read of his prior to my writing this book focused really on the 2 Stalins. One was the Georgian Stalin, the very troubling, notorious son of Georgia that some feel in my native country put Georgia on the map to a certain extent in the 20th century, for better or worse. And then the other Stalin being the Soviet Red Tsar. And obviously, these 2 Stalins are talked about and thought about a lot, not just by historians, but also en masse by those who think about these topics. So I'm not the only crazy that spent many, many nights thinking about trying to make sense of the different layers of Stalin and Stalinism and the sorts of marks that era as a whole left on not only my native country, but also to some extent on my generation, the generation of millennials, hence the title of the book. The third Stalin that I tried to grapple with and really, really tried to probe questions such as, does that third Stalin exist at all? Because my hypothesis for when I wrote the proposal of the book that I pitched to my publishers at Lexington Books, Rowman & Littlefield, was actually the working title was The Tale of Three Stalins. And in many ways, I felt that it was a tale because it's mythology at this point. It stops being even history after a while, because Stalin's figure, historically speaking, has gone through so many incarnations and reincarnations that it's very difficult, I think, for us to talk about sort of a static version of Stalin. And this was Stalin. There's many versions. There's many different schools of thought that talk about his policies and his legacies through many different prisms. So for me, it sort of was tongue-in-cheek a tale. And obviously, it's not a fairy tale because it was much too tragic. But the more I thought about that third Stalin in the process of writing this book, the more I realized that that third Stalin has the least to do with Stalin himself. So there's the Russian and the Georgian Stalin, sort of the Soviet and the Georgian Stalin. But the one that I was trying to uncover in this process was the one that is perhaps not so much about Stalin, but about Stalins Millennials. And I know that there will be some pushback probably among my compatriots that will say, well, we're not Stalins Millennials. I don't think it's a very direct cause and effect situation here. I do believe very much in memory wars and memory DNA. And I do feel that many of us, if not directly, at least through our ancestors, through our families, because they lived through that very frightening period, particularly the first half of the 20th century, inevitably we were influenced by Stalin's legacies, by Stalin's policies, by history at large. So it is very easy for us to say, well, I wasn't alive during that era, and therefore I am not Stalin's millennial. But I felt through my personal process of exploring these questions and writing this book very much like writing a diary, because that's how it genuinely felt. I was not even pretending to write a history book. The world does not need another fantastic biography of Stalin. I would never be able to even compete with some of my heroes that have done so and extremely successfully. But rather, I was trying to look through various prisms at this kaleidoscope of who Stalin is, or who these Stalins are, and what it means for my generation, and what the implications and repercussions are, which unfortunately we are living through that today, that these implications and these legacies are still sadly very much alive in 2022.
Tinatin, one of the things that makes your book really interesting is exactly something that you just alluded to, which is the fact that it's not a straight history book, but rather you have also you're in the book as well. And I think that that's what makes it both unusual and incredibly interesting. I wonder if you want to say just a few more words about how you came to write the book? Sort of what motivated you? What sort of brought you to the point that you wanted to think about what effect does Stalin have on a generation that's far removed, right, from the time that he was alive?
In fact, I can't really claim and say that this was my idea and I had this grand plan to write a book about Stalin or about Stalin's legacies. It was a school assignment. My professor, one of my great mentors, Alexander Cooley, who until recently was the director of the Harriman Institute, my academic home, it was for his class, for his Soviet legacies class, that we all wrote various papers, and he asked us to choose several themes that we could from different weeks of the semester, and we could write our sort of culminating piece at the end of the semester. And I chose Stalin, I chose nostalgia, and I chose nationalism. And then I put these three themes into some sort of dialogue where I was able to see if there is some sort of connection between these three themes. And sadly, there is. It turned out to be something that I was able to think about not only in a sort of a 15-page paper format, but also pursue over the years through my research in the region, outside of the region, and ultimately when COVID hit. And we had slightly more time on our hands, even though I remained very busy at work. At the time I was working for the mayor's office in New York City. I had the nights to myself because we were quarantining. And what I chose to do was to actually start working on a book idea. And there was some interest with the publishers that eventually ended up signing me, and my editor worked very closely with me on the proposal. So that class paper became a book, not necessarily because I had any plans to write a book, because I felt that would be too big a statement someone in their 30s could make and say, I'm going to write a book about Stalin. It was, I think, in retrospect, because it was COVID and because we were beginning to rethink a lot of what we thought was true. We were sort of just changing our mindsets, the way we saw ourselves, even, so a lot of time to self-reflect. And that was one way that I was able to self-reflect, by writing about what Stalin and Stalinism and that era as a whole meant to me, and why I feel the way I feel about him. And that is, like some of my compatriots may agree, it's not just sort of very clear black or white, I hate him or I am fascinated by him. I think it's the paradox that eventually got us thinking about these topics. And it's the paradox that is so difficult to put your finger on, because you can't really say this is exactly how I feel about Stalin, and that never changes. It is never in a state of a flux. That state of a flux, that fluid understanding of, I am absolutely horrified by what he did, by what his cronies did, what my generation is also going through today as a result, what affected my own family, because my family fell prey to the Great Purges and NKVD, Beria, et cetera, but also here I am spending 4 years of my life in my 30s writing about this man that was on the one hand a monster, but also a fascinating monster. And that was something that I tried to understand. Why am I spending all this time thinking about someone that makes me feel so extremely uncomfortable, and at the same time fascinated by the sheer fact that we are still talking about these topics and they are still very, very relevant.
So Tintin, you were born in Georgia and your family is Georgian, but you've lived in Russia. And there's something, I think I mentioned this to you in an earlier conversation. You make an interesting argument that in Georgia, in contrast to Russia, admiration of Stalin, and I use the word admiration sort of guardedly here, admiration of Stalin and support of authoritarianism do not overlap. So that in Georgia, in contrast to Russia. Can you say a little bit more about that argument?
I think it's a personal argument, meaning that for Georgians, and it's very hard. And as a sociologist, I'm sure you will appreciate that I'm trying to be very wary of the fact that I don't want to generalize and overgeneralize, because I can't speak on behalf of all Georgians or say that all Georgian millennials even feel or think a certain way. But I think there is a dominating layer of the society, in Georgia today, that would argue that when we think about Stalin, we don't necessarily think about Stalin as the Soviet Red Tsar, but rather we think about Stalin, the man who was born in Georgia, who went to the seminary, who wrote apparently wonderful poems, and then he sort of crossed the border, went over to Russia, and he changed, which I think is an extremely biased way of looking at Stalin, that somehow he was wonderful when he was Georgian, and then when he became Russified and Sovietized, then all the evil started to come out of him. But many Georgians would still try to claim that we feel that way, that he would have been a different Stalin had he stayed in Georgia. And because of that, when we talk about Stalin, when we go to his museum in Gori, in his native Gori, outside of Tbilisi, and when we have these sort of historical conversations about Joseph Stalin, we don't necessarily talk about Stalin, but we talk about Djurashvili. And that allows us to just psychologically have the capacity and the ability to separate ourselves from the evil and say that, well, we're not talking about Stalin, we're talking about Djurashvili. And then when things get very difficult and very problematic and very complicated and complex, then we say, now let's talk about authoritarianism through the prism of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader. So those were the two very different versions, not only of Stalin, but also perceptions of Stalin and conversations about Stalin that I was able to witness firsthand when doing my research, when talking about him to my Georgian compatriots, and also talking about him to Russian colleagues and friends.
So I think there's a lot of interest, obviously, given the times, in how all of this is sort of resonating in Russian politics. So I wonder if you want to expand on the question of how, because you talk about this in the book, how has Putin used the figure of Stalin in building an autocratic Russia, in legitimating an autocratic Russia, and maybe even in building his own, you use the term leadership cult.
And probably his legacies as well, I think, to a certain extent, perhaps, that one could argue that he is still in the process of constructing. I had a very different sense of how Putin was using Stalin before 2022. I thought it was a little bit more subtle. I thought there was very little mention of Stalin explicitly, but rather a more explicit conversation about the Great Patriotic War as sort of that redeeming, glorifying component of Russian identity, including Russia's post-Soviet identity. So when we heard about Stalin coming out of Vladimir Putin's mouth, the words left his mouth in a very sort of an extremely subtle way of saying that the greatness of the Soviet nation through the prism of the Great Patriotic War was in many ways the responsibility and the role that Stalin played, the result of that. But he was very, very cautious when he couched certain terms that he used when describing Stalin, to be very careful not to get too much pushback from his people, from his voters as well, that he would never be glorifying Stalin, but rather glorifying the Soviet experiment, and particularly the Great Patriotic War and the evil of Nazism that Stalin and the Soviet people, and I would put the Soviet people perhaps over Stalin in these conversations that Putin had, those narratives pertaining to how the world won the war against the evil of Nazism. It was because of the greatness and the resilience and the character of the Soviet people under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. Today, however, we are seeing very, very different conversations and narratives coming out of Vladimir Putin's office, not in the least on air, on live television. And I think one of the stellar examples was the day when he announced that Russia would be starting, quote unquote, the special military operation in Ukraine. There we heard actual names of certain actors. Obviously Stalin less so, Lenin a lot more so. And that to me meant that whatever was subtle before has lost any and all resemblance to subtlety. It's become much more explicit, much more aggressive. I mean, in terms of the vocabulary used, in terms of the references, including historical references, it's very, very deliberate now. It's sort of very much, for lack of a better term, in your face. And that to me was most fascinating, because in the book, I was trying to hint, without seeming as someone sort of someone who was saying that Russia would be going downhill in terms of how they were able to wrestle with historical legacies, because I didn't want any of my Russian colleagues and friends to think that I was being extremely pessimistic about Russia's future. I was trying to be pragmatic and understand that we have not seen the worst of how history will be manipulated and abused by the ruling regime. And unfortunately, we are seeing that today. The manifestation is much more than anyone could have predicted, or most could have predicted. I certainly had no idea. In fact, a few days before the invasion, I had some of my colleagues in meetings with me, and they would ask, do you think he's going to do it? Is he going all in? And I thought, of course not. He's much too rational and much too pragmatic. And obviously that has all gone out of the metaphorical window. So had I had the opportunity to write the epilogue again, just because I finished the book shortly before the war started, it was really very last minute. The epilogue was done very, very last, after the majority of the peer review was completed. I would not have changed a word in it. And not because I'm trying to make myself feel better, because I can't turn the time back, but because I genuinely feel that if we think we know how this story ends, I think we are lying to ourselves. I don't think anybody knows. And what worries me the most is that I don't think Vladimir Putin knows. I think some of these policies and actions are very much improv. And there may be more improvisation than we could have anticipated from someone who was hailed as one of the most rational decision makers. Whether we liked him or not, we all had some sort of consensus on the fact that he's rational, he's predictable to a certain degree. I think he has proven us all wrong, including those who are in his inner circle.
So I want to say, just to ask you, maybe comment on something in the book, which is the sort of millennial piece of this, yes, right? Because you talk about Stalin, but you also talk about millennials. And you say something very interesting in the book, which is that the post-Soviet generation has only known Putin as their leader, and they've been socialized into a benign version of Stalin as a modernizer, and his malign acts as sort of necessary in the given global context. What is the sociological significance of that?
Now I've got an expert asking an amateur a question.
Well, but I'm asking about something that you yes, are writing about. I mean, the millennials sort of, yes, when I think about Stalin, I mean, I was raised here, and I've never had sort of varieties of different information about it. It's always been, the things that Stalin did were bad. There's not sort of variations on that.
Exactly.
But the idea that a sort of benign version of Stalin has really been dominant for young people being socialized through various agents of socialization in Russia seems significant to me. So maybe say a little bit more about how it's significant.
Well, I think we can't forget the fact, had we lived through the worst of Stalin, and also to a certain degree, the best, and I say that term very loosely, the best of Stalin, as far as the Soviet people were concerned, because they were obviously reading very one-sided reports about what was actually happening in the country and outside of the country. We could very well claim that many people also thought that Stalin was benign, and he was doing what was necessary, and he was doing it for the greatness of the Soviet people. It was only in hindsight and through reading archival material and hearing from those who suddenly, after his death in particular, sort of were a little bit more motivated to talk a little bit more openly. One could argue and say that they never really talked very, very openly, because that fear, that psychological fear, that scar remained intact, and they were never able to shed it completely. So when we say that somehow, some say, well, Putin is a benign version of Stalin. I think Stalin was a benign version of Stalin when he was in power as well. So I would urge us to think about the next generation, not even my generation of millennials, but the one after and the ones after my generation more broadly. The way that they will assess Putin and his actions will probably be very different to the way we are able to do it ourselves. Even absolute experts like yourself, I think we are very much in the moment. And I think we're influenced by emotions because we are human after all, and the human factor is taking a toll. And so is the fact that we have not really had a chance to process what is happening to a degree where we can talk about it in historical terms, in policy terms, and really truly analyze it, even use the terminology. I find it extremely difficult as a student of political science to use some of the terminology right now because we don't know really how we can describe what is happening today until we've had some time to breathe in the aftermath and to really assess what happened. And the millennials, I think, are in an interesting, they're at crossroads in many ways, whereas one could have said a few years ago that we were not even at the crossroads because we had never really witnessed the prior version ourselves firsthand of Stalinism. I think today, knowing what we know about the Stalin era, but not everything, but still knowing more than our ancestors did, seeing what we are seeing today vis-a-vis Putin, but not also knowing exactly how that will be assessed and analyzed with time and over time is interesting, because I think to some extent, the millennials we have this added responsibility now that perhaps we did not have a few months ago, where how the next generation thinks and talks about what is happening today will in many ways be our shared responsibility, or at least we are those who cannot afford to be complicit, and we cannot afford to be silent. We cannot afford to silence others because we've been there. And although this is a very different situation that we're in many ways, it is not. I think history has come back in a full circle, and it's very frightening because it has very different technological connotations that it did not have under Stalin, for example. Social media plays a vital component here. And because of that, we are responsible in how we then essentially collect the material, the content, and pass it on to the upcoming generations. Archives perhaps will be less useful here. I think social media will be extremely useful. It can also be it can abuse facts and misuse facts. And that frightens me, because one could argue and say that archives are not also 100% factual either, because whoever put something in a folder, in a given box, did it for a reason. And there was that added layer of complication, because yes, we're reading these archives and it's fascinating. And then on the other hand, we can't forget that someone put that folder together too. And they had certain motivations as well. And there was certain agenda. And we're seeing that with social media. Obviously, there's way more fingers in the pie. So there's multiple people putting a folder together and multiple people putting various documents inside the folder. And I think the succession and the chronology of those documents in this metaphorical social media folder is also very interesting, because we have date stamps now. And not that we didn't have date stamps before, but it was easier to alter date stamps. You can still alter them today, but it's a little more work. And it's just very interesting to see what comes after what in terms of the various narratives that we are reading through various platforms, because obviously now the platforms are also, for a global internet, the platforms are extremely isolated, and there are islands, because we have Telegram in Russia, we have Twitter here, but no one in Russia is really looking at Twitter or bothering. So you can be a lot more open on Twitter, because not a lot of Russians, including, I'm sure Roskomnadzor, the media watchdog in Russia, is able to read it, but they're not going to bother with it as much as they would with Telegram, for example, because that is the dominant platform in the country.
So speaking of Twitter, I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to invite the members of our audience to either put a question into the chat box or else to raise your hand and speak. But just as my last question, for the moment, I sent you, so Tintin, I sent you a few days ago a screenshot of a tweet that was put out by, I believe, a Lithuanian member of the European Parliament, I think it was the European Parliament.
Yes.
And she found herself in the Tbilisi airport, where she took a picture of some busts of Stalin, and she essentially said, why are Georgians still selling busts of Stalin? Don't they want to be in the European Union? And how are these two things compatible? So I'm sort of going to turn over that question to you and ask you, what would you say to this Lithuanian member of the European Parliament in response to that question?
And I think we can't forget the fact that she was also the former Minister of Defense. So she's wearing that hat as well, because it's a security issue for her. And because of her country's Baltic experience as well. And I can completely empathize and sympathize with this sort of outlook and perception. And I have immense respect on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think even though the tweet, I'm sure, was absolutely harmless, and by no means was it trying to criticize the Georgian people, because the Latvian people and the Georgian people are allies in many aspects. I think we were having this conversation about what did that tweet actually mean, and the more I thought about it after our phone call, the more I realized that this was sort of an invitation to the Georgian public, and not just the government of Georgia, because I think there's a split in Georgia where the public thinks one thing and the ruling party thinks another. And then there's also the opposition party that has different thoughts as well. And I mean, talk about a nesting doll. We are a nesting doll, a living, breathing nesting doll in Georgia. This was potentially an invitation to the Georgian public, and perhaps to a certain degree, the Georgian ruling party, to actually tell us once and for all, what is Georgia's course, political course, societal course as well. Which tracks are we on? Because if we're trying to be on two very different tracks that go in two very different directions, this is a train crash at best. And I don't think the Georgian people on my feed anyway, and after you sent me the screenshot, I actually took a look at Twitter to see if the Georgians had reshared it and commented, etc. And what I found very interesting was that they actually took it in a way that was sort of kind of offensive, right? We were somehow insulted, I think, broadly. Again, I use that term very loosely. Many Georgians on Twitter were somewhat insulted, because I do understand where the insult comes from, this feeling of insult. So we have a very complicated relationship with Stalin, particularly complicated because Stalin was Jugashvili, and remained Jugashvili for many Georgians. And that makes it sociologically, I think, extremely complicated for us, because it's a paradox within a paradox within a paradox. And it's hard for us to separate the different moving parts from one whole piece. So when anyone, including someone as remarkable as a politician whose country went through a remarkable experience post-Soviet collapse, but also obviously before the Soviet collapse, during the Soviet occupation, it is very easy for us to say that, one person thinks that this is not a complicated matter, but it really is a complicated matter. There's no sort of yes or no, black or white answer. On the other hand, this was a wonderful opportunity, I think, for my country, my native country, to actually take this baton and talk about why we feel the way we feel about Stalin, and how having Stalin's museum intact in Georgia is important for us in having these conversations. And it's important for the past generation, my generation, the next few generations, to actually have an open conversation and be able to think about these topics. And that exhibit helps us a great deal. Just the fact that we have the museum, I think we need to keep the museum. I had a wonderful conversation with Georgian colleagues during one of my talks with Works in Progress, American Councils in Tbilisi last week, where we talked about why we should keep the Stalin Museum intact. What we do with it is different, but it should stay in some capacity, in some form, and it's important for our identity as well. But then on the other hand, we could have taken that tweet and said, okay, here's why it's okay for us to have the museum. It's okay for us to sell the memorabilia and to attract some tourists who might be more interested in Georgia as Stalin's birthplace rather than all the wonderful things that Georgia has to offer. But then on the other hand, that by no means is going to get in the way of our European pro-Western course. I haven't seen a whole lot of people take that opportunity and run with it. But then again, I haven't been checking the tweet obsessively to see if anyone's done anything with it. But I think the two are not mutually exclusive. And we need to bear that in mind, that we cannot ignore our history. We cannot ignore what happened, because it was 70 years of our living memory that you cannot just erase just because the Soviet Union collapsed and the Iron Curtain was lifted. It is still very much part of who we are. And if we don't talk about it, and by we, I mean Georgians, if we don't address those very painful scars and wounds, because there's still wounds and not many are even scars, they haven't healed in any way, it is potentially very dangerous for us, because then we become very myopic, and that's not necessarily a good thing for our future. Sometimes we do have to look back in order to move forward.
Thank you. And again, congratulations on a wonderful book. I have a couple of questions in the chat box that actually more than two that I can share, but is there anybody who I would invite folks to raise their hand if they'd like to ask a question themselves? And if not, then I will read from a couple of the questions, including one I got by direct message. Ladies and gentlemen, does anyone want to ask a question before I turn to the questions in the chat box? I feel like I'm in class suddenly. Okay. All right.
Extra credit.
Yes, indeed, always. I'm going to ask a question that came to me here in direct message. Please feel free to raise your hands if you do want to ask a question yourselves. This is an interesting question. We know nationalism and imperialism were always an overt and subtle component of Stalin's rhetoric and actions. Yet it was officially a left-wing program. Mm-hmm. How is Putin able to turn Stalin's communism into a historical justification for Putin's contemporary right-wing extremism? That is an interesting question, because you're talking about what kind of squares the circle where you have something that is, in theory at least, right, a kind of left-wing communist program with something that seems to resonate heavily. I think Marlene would be able to comment on this more than I could, with the kind of right-wing, right, the European right wing, not just Russia, across the entire European continent.
I think one of the places where we can start exploring the answer to this question, although I don't think there is just one answer. I think there's many, and within these answers, there's many more questions. But one place we could start is in the 90s. And perhaps we can't forget that the 90s happened. And because the 90s happened in Russia, and because of that whole experience that some would say was not necessarily a success for Russia, that allows the likes of Vladimir Putin to use that narrative in justifying this very sort of right-wing approach, this change of direction, absolute change of direction, because it's very easy for the Putin regime, once there's talks of democracy and the sort of the left of the center, if not leftist movements and narratives and just desires, even just human desire to go back to what some felt was a freer, more hopeful era, even though it was very troubling in so many ways and for so many people outside of a couple of cities in Russia. I do feel that because of that ability to tap into that absolute chaos within our very vivid living memory, to say that, well, you remember the 90s? Remember how that ended? Remember that experiment with democracy and the leftist movements? Do you remember the empty shelves in the stores? So you couldn't buy bread and you had to stand in line for hours and hours and hours to get just the basics for your family. Do you want to go back to that? Or do you prefer stability with a tighter grip? But the tight grip is for your own benefit. It's so patronizing, I think, the way the Putin regime talks about a lot of these policies, sort of justifying the policies and talking about the 90s in a very, very patronizing manner, as if the Russian people don't have a mind of their own. That really does resonate with me in many ways, because I was very young in the 90s, but nonetheless, I wasn't so young that I don't remember. So for context, I was born in 1984. And I love that, because I always want to claim that the book 1984 was written for me. But being born in 1984, I think gave me a wonderful array into some of what was still happening, what had just happened, and what was about to happen. And I do remember the 90s very well because of that. I lived in not only Georgia, in Tbilisi, but also in Moscow. During those, the empty shelves and the fear and the chaos, I remember that. But I also remember in the air that there was a lot of hope. And I'm talking primarily about the later years in the 90s. Yes, very troubling. Post-1996, it was a different Russia to the one post-1991. But nonetheless, there were more options. There were more opportunities, some deadlier than others, but nonetheless, there was some sort of resemblance, at least an illusion of choice and agency. That has disappeared. And the Putin regime claims that has disappeared in the name of stability. But unfortunately, the flip side of stability is authoritarianism, autocracy, stagnation at best, but nonetheless stagnation. And now the conversation changes completely and the examples change completely moving forward post February 24th of 2022.
So there's another question in here, which I will read. And can we say that Putin exalts can we really say that Putin exalts the Soviet experiment, as it became crystal clear during his speech before the invasion that he sincerely despises Lenin and Stalin for their nationalities policy? So the very foundation of this experiment, interpreted by Terry Martin long ago as quote unquote affirmative action empire. So sort of squaring what Putin, right? Squaring kind of Putin's attitude towards nationalities, I think, is what's being asked here versus Stalin's.
Well, one thing that I will say right off the bat, and again, this is my personal, not necessarily professional, because that is not what I do. My day job is in security, and I'm working on very sort of current security related issues in my day job in that capacity. So I'm no historian. So please forgive any of my sort of personal musings, because these are just musings of someone who cares about these topics a great deal, who has read some of the works of those that I truly admire, that know so much more than I ever will myself. So I'm trying to then make sense of the different perceptions and analyses, and then I sort of gather them into one piece, the different pieces of the puzzle. But my understanding, based on what we are witnessing today, and based on what we've also seen with Putin over the last few years, not just the last few weeks, I don't think, to this day, I will still try to argue that I do not think he is trying to recreate Soviet Union 2.0. I really, really don't think so. I think he wants to recreate and refabricate Russia's influence in its near abroad. But I don't think he is so naive that he thinks that he can absolutely recreate the Soviet Union and just call it something else and be done with it and be very happy and reclaim all of the lands. I still don't think that he is so irrational that he feels he can do that without pushback, without economically disastrous implications for Russia as well. But on the other hand, I do think that there are many, many, many policies upon which a lot of what Putin is doing today, he is in dire disagreement with both Lenin and with Stalin as well. It's just, I don't think that he thinks it plays to his, sort of panders to his audience, so to speak. The audience, I mean those who will still more than likely vote for him. That they would appreciate if he went ahead and lambasted and criticized either Lenin or Stalin, because there are those whose votes he will still be able to secure if he focuses on some of what he thinks were positive results and connotations of their respective rules. But in terms of talking about the Soviet experiment, revisiting the Soviet experiment, whether it's nationalities policies or any other policies, through the prism of Putin today sitting in the Kremlin in 2022, I still think that he is sufficiently rational to not be under any illusion that that can still work.
I think one of the things that kind of is a takeaway, both from what you've been saying and also from your book, is that to a great extent, and it's interesting, I think Stalin more so than Lenin is really sort of just a vessel in your story. In a sense, the third Stalin is a vessel, not so much a historical figure as just kind of a repository for what different groups want him to be, you know, and want him to represent. I think that's, and it's interesting that seems to be, I would argue, at least more kind of characteristic of Stalin than of Lenin, that somehow he has that sort of, that empty space that can be filled with what people want, you know, what different groups want him to be. Yeah, which is an observation, I think, from your book. Are there other questions that folks would like to ask at this point? Dr. Marina Romanova, can you unmute yourself and go ahead?
Hello, thank you very much. It's really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to read the book. I have a question. It's actually, as we know, the former Soviet republics and Central Asian, for instance, and those like you are from originally, and your neighbors like Armenia, I wonder to what extent, from your point of view, those republics are kind of, in a way, following and keeping the legacy of Stalin, and how much it is kind of like showing us different results of following that to this or that extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Romanova. I was actually initially thinking when I wrote the book about the two legacies in Georgia and in Russia of Stalin and the Stalin era, I also thought, wouldn't it be interesting for folks who are much more sort of better versed in other countries in the region to write their versions of what are the legacies in their countries? Because I could speak about the Georgian experience, I could speak to a certain degree about the Russian experience, having grown up in both of these countries in many ways, but I could not speak about the Central Asian experience, for example. And within the Central Asian experience, there would be at least 5 versions, different legacies that we could talk about as well. Also, the Baltic experience would be very interesting because we're talking about legacies that don't necessarily have to bear the name Stalin. A lot of these legacies, whether it's a little bit more comfortable for some nations versus others, whether it's more prominent for their experiences, if we take Stalin out, but we keep a lot of these components that are part of the legacy or legacies, then it's easier for other countries to talk about it. And obviously the 3 words, the 3 concepts that I use in the title, and you know, here we have nostalgia, trauma, and nationalism. Those 3 are still concepts that I believe any one of the countries within that part of the world, within our sort of neck of the woods, many could claim that, yes, we had an experience dealing with these 3 concepts. And they may not call it Stalin's legacies, but it is very much a legacy of that era that their country lived through, whether they were willingly part of it or occupied by the forces, but in some way they lived through it. We all sat on that one metaphorical Soviet train at one time. And I think to a degree, even the satellite countries were also in the other cars behind us, following us. They had a little more leeway. I think they had a little more options, a little bit more freedom to at least maintain some sort of agency because they were satellites and not part of Soviet Union proper. But in terms of the influence of a lot of these concepts that we talk about when we talk about Stalin's legacies, they are very much part of that broader experience in that part of the world as part of that history that, and I keep saying this, but I think it's important for us to remember that we talk about this as history, but it is still very, very vivid in our living memory. Hence it becoming a memory war of sorts. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Any other questions that you'd like to, Yvonne O?
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for this conversation. I really appreciate it a lot because it's given me a sense of the region and which I'm unfamiliar with. I noted that there's, you talked a lot about nostalgia and trauma and how fresh some of it is, especially. And I think these days, a lot of the crisis that we have endured, it comes with that trauma that is still fresh to a whole generation that experienced it. Because you know, when we talk about the global pandemic, there are still people alive who can remember, a recent pandemic, a not so recent pandemic, but still within our lifetime. How much of a motivator do you think this nostalgia is, especially for those who are somewhat power hungry or hungry for what they believe is the good old days, where there is, like you say, there is guaranteed food on the shelves. There is guaranteed, I say this very carefully, law and order. They have that security. And unfortunately, they don't realize there had been many injustices over that time because people were well fed, feeling secure. How much of a motivator is that idea of nostalgia, and then that worry that will be hungry, that trauma that they went through, that makes people want to sort of recreate a crisis in order to get back to the good old days?
That's a fascinating question, Yvonne. I think nostalgia, if I were to pick one of the pillars from the book that I think is the central pillar, I think it's nostalgia. And even though I have a separate chapter in the book on nostalgia, nostalgia is for those who have read the book already, and I think a couple have, just looking at the audience that we have right now. I think you may agree that that leitmotif is present as a connecting thread between all of the chapters. I think the fact that I was even writing the book is a living proof that perhaps in some very twisted way, I was nostalgic for something that never was. But the key here is the fact that it never was. And we remember it a certain way, but it was probably very, very different. And not just probably, but it was certainly very, very different. But in our memory, it has been captured as a snapshot, as a Polaroid almost, that is still very colorful and it hasn't really faded yet. And we remember that feeling, but we remember more positives than negatives, because then we are able to avoid some of the cognitive dissonance. I don't mean to delve into psychology too much, but there is much more dissonance, I think, when we have to talk about the negatives and not dwell too much on the negatives. And in that respect, not only has nostalgia permeated a lot of these narratives, but also politicians, as we know, and I think our country, the United States, is also one where some leaders, more so than other leaders, have been very good at using that tool, using nostalgia as a tool, even in election campaigns. And this isn't always nefarious, this isn't always malign. Sometimes it's benign, sometimes it's just pure political agenda, and we can't blame them. They need the votes. They're a politician. They need people to come out and vote for them. We can love them, we can hate them, but that is what a politician does. So it's hard. We shouldn't maybe just, necessarily judge them without acknowledging the fact that, yes, they will tap into every single sentiment to get their vote. And I think nostalgia is not only alive and well among the politicians, but also among us. Some of us in the audience right now that are having this conversation, I'm absolutely certain that there are aspects that we are nostalgic about, primarily because it was our past, it was our youth. And I think sociologically, and Dinah, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is one of the pillars that our identity does rest on as well, because we feel better when we remember the positive. And therefore, nostalgia then becomes positive and not necessarily negative. Unfortunately, what worries me, though, is that there is a flip side to this seemingly very benign coin that says nostalgia on one side, and that other side, the flip side, can be misused at best or abused at worst. And it is sort of within the authority of leaders, various leaders, to abuse nostalgia, because when we are reminded of empty shelves, then we're talking about negative aspects of nostalgia. Now, do you really want to go back to that when at the end of the day, you need to feed X amount of mouths in your household? So yes, vote for stagnation because it's stability, but at least you are going to have a loaf of bread on your table in the kitchen. And there we get into a very, very, very gray area for sort of the ethical questions of what's ethical and what isn't, and what should be used for the greater good perhaps with quotation marks around it as a concept, and what is purely being used for sort of political agency and political gains. And I think in Russia, there is more that is being done vis-a-vis nostalgia for political gain than one would hope.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that I will just take this the last 3 minutes that we have to congratulate Tinatin on her very interesting book again, to ask Tinatin if you want to make any last sort of comments or observations, and I think then we'll be about ready to wrap it up for our audience.
Thank you very, very much. First of all, and once again, as I noted in my introductory remarks, this was a wonderful opportunity, and not because it is George Washington University, but also because of the very bright minds that are able to put their minds together and have these conversations. Because even though the book is in print and it's sort of out and it's tangible, it is for me very much a malleable, very fluid process. I think one of the great benefits of being on a book tour for me right now is being able to have these conversations without claiming that I have the answers, because I do not. I have more questions as a result of writing the book, but certainly not many answers. So being able to have these conversations, I walk away from these talks, including this very fascinating conversation, with a better sense of at least what questions I should be asking. And I would just urge us all, without coming across as preachy, to understand that every experience of every nation, including the Russian experience, it is very unique to Russia, to the Russian people. It is very easy for us to make certain assessments and perhaps even judgment calls of, why are they electing this man? Why are they doing this to themselves? That's a legitimate question, but we also need to understand their history and their experience, and unfortunately, the experience that they are living through today, because there is no one answer for them either. If we think we have many questions, they have many, many more, but unfortunately, way less in terms of the options that they have available. So perhaps what we can do on our part is not forget that the tragic war that is unraveling in Ukraine right now, and the tragic circumstances under which the Ukrainian people are existing today and struggling to exist, they are in many ways on the right side of history. My lamentation is vis-a-vis those who are on the wrong side of history, because when the conventional war is over, and and I don't like using the term free world because it's very loaded, but a very, very big part of the world that is trying to be on the right side of history is on Ukraine's side. And I feel very sad for some very bright minds in Russia who are trying to do their work, who are trying to be morally in the sort of the right standing, but they are also wrestling with, if I say what I believe, what will happen to my family? And it's very easy for us to pass judgment and say, just speak up. I still feel that they should speak up. And the greater the number of people who speak up do speak up, the better ultimately. But it's very hard to be that first and the second and the 100th to speak up, to stand up against what is happening. And I hope that there will be a little bit of support at least left for those, and I mean moral support, because our attention is on the Ukrainian people and the people that I love. I have many friends in Ukraine and I wholeheartedly support them, every single cause that they're standing up for. But at the same time, I'm reminding myself to not forget about those who are, I think, going to be the ultimate victim after this tragedy. In the end, I think Ukraine will be stronger than it ever has been. My fear is that the Russian people will be in the weakest position, and especially that very slim, but nonetheless a sliver of society that thinks the way we think and that truly wants to stand on the right side of history. But it's just a matter of having that moral support that is backing you up to feel safe, to feel safe to stand up against the regime. It's very hard being the first. It's very hard. And it's very hard being the 100th too. And because of the sheer size of the country, the first couple million will find it very difficult to stand up. I just hope that they will be able to stand on their 2 feet and be strong and speak up, because we, the people, and I'm not quoting the UN Charter, but I think it came across as such, and also obviously there's the US Constitution, but I was thinking more about the UN. It is our responsibility to stand with the people of Ukraine, but it is, I think, also our responsibility to not forget about those in Russia who are staying victimized in their own country. And I don't believe that many of them chose this. And if they could, if they had the choice, I don't think they would choose this war.
Indeed. Thank you, Tinatin. Thank you to our audience members. Thank you to Iris and the Elliott School. And yeah, have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tinatin, again, and congratulations.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Dinah. Thank you very much.